You know what an Iron Maiden is, right? Isn't that one torture device from like the Middle Ages where they stuffed you in a coffin full of nails or something? While you are wrong, and in spite of the fact that I chose to narrate your statement with a stereotypical stupid person's voice, there isn't anything actually unintelligent about that position. I just want to strawman you, that's all. That's what is often presented in pop culture. You have a finite amount of time and effort, and choosing to devote that to something so trivial rather than any of your other more pressing concerns is actually a wise decision. Maybe I could learn something from you. But as a quick example of that pop culture view, this is printed on a mid 20th century postcard made by the Ripleys, believe it or not. Quote, this famous torture instrument of the Dark Ages was also known as the Spanish mantle. Brought from Nuremberg, Germany, by Mr. Ripley, stands as a mute reminder of the ignorance of the people of the Dark Ages, and as an accusing monument to the cruelty of men. End quote. Like I said, this is such an irrelevant issue that I wouldn't really blame you for just taking it on faith. I foresee a pretty immediate interjection, though. I imagine that by this point in the video, there are already plenty of people going, dude, everybody knows that Iron Maidens were just something made up by the Victorians, that way they could feel superior to the people before them. This, arguably, is just as wrong of a belief as the earlier position. Despite the fact that I narrated your hypothetical statement with a smug person's voice, I actually wouldn't fault you for taking that position either. This attempted revision has also been pretty well circulated. I just wanted to strawman you again, that's all. As an example of that understanding, the English Wikipedia article on Iron Maidens has this as their opening statement. Quote, the Iron Maiden is a torture device believed to have been first created in the 19th century. It consists of a solid iron cabinet with a hinged front and a spike-covered interior, sufficiently tall to enclose a human being. While often popularly thought to have been used in the medieval period, there is no known mention of the Iron Maiden before the 19th century. They have become a popular image in media involving the Middle Ages and involving torture chambers. End quote. This is basically the assumption that I myself probably would have taken before getting into the research as much as I did. And to put my cards on the table here, I am willingly going against both the older view that Iron Maidens were this cruel medieval torture device that were actually used, and the more current view that they were some Victorian fiction. I believe both are in error, and even regarding the view I've found commonly attributed to real, accredited, and qualified historians in their relevant fields, I still strongly disagree even with them, in spite of their greater degree of nuance and accuracy. As far as I can tell, I am the only person alive who has formulated the idea that I will present later on. In contrast to the pretty strong statements I just made, I actually really dislike being a contrarian, but against my preferred inclinations, I've taken in a lot of evidence and pretty unavoidably come to some pretty bold conclusions. And as much as it may benefit me to present that in such a way that I could plead myself as just a mere speculator or something in the case that I'm wrong, I really think I've actually been given a bit of a gift here and having discovered something special, and thus I have a duty to make things clear and insofar as I'm willing to assert something, also try to make it falsifiable. I know the stereotype of some random guy on the internet saying that everybody is wrong and that actually he is right, as probably an abyssal track record at this point, but please just trust me. Or to formulate that thought a little more carefully, I don't think that any of the falsehood here is born out of either incompetency or deception, rather that just the concept of an Iron Maiden has been subjected to entirely the wrong field of study, and furthermore that any of this could really only have been revealed basically in just like the last decade. I just happen to be like the first person here. I'm gonna save the fullness of this discussion for later, but this is very often presented as just a task for archaeologists and legal scholars of a medieval background. And as of right now, I would say that at the very least it is a mostly lost piece of early modern Germanic folklore that could rival pretty much anything found in the Brothers Grimm in regards to just how interesting it is. I probably don't even come close to understanding even half, maybe even a tenth of what could potentially be grasped about our object of interest. I am extremely unqualified for this, and I don't have the means to bring this story to its finish line. As I said, I really just happen to be the first person to investigate what is present here this deeply since the mass availability of sources on the internet. And I hope that somebody who can take this story to its full conclusion hopefully finds us at some point. My central claim of this video is this: we are entirely wrong in what we even imagine an Iron Maiden to be, and I'm not entirely sure what they even are still. But I do know enough to know that everybody is wrong, and even our basic image seems to be in some pretty big error, to the point that it should probably be reinvestigated. In circles of serious academic prowess, this has often been continually passed over as just some random myth, and for some pretty intuitive reasons, in my opinion. But in reality, I really think this is just the tip of some iceberg. How deep or in what ways that iceberg goes, I know not, but from everything I can tell, it looks like an iceberg. And before we start, I feel like I should say, like, an obligatory listener's discretion warning here. I'm not going to be gushing over violence or gore throughout the video. All of this is more of a historical inquiry, but given the subject matter, some rather grim language may be necessary at times. Oh, and for all the old heads who are just on the edge of their seats waiting for me to reference their favorite metal band, I sincerely apologize for being born after their prime. As a starting point, let's go back to the year 1893. A replica of the supposed first Iron Maiden is presented at the Chicago World's Fair, and it really seems that at this point the Maiden went from a thing that people just kind of knew about to something that could be referenced in popular media, and everybody in the audience could be reasonably expected to know about it. Bram Stoker, the guy who would go on to write Dracula, wrote in that same year his short story, The Squaw, which used that supposed original Iron Maiden as its centerpiece. He would write this of it, quote, "The central object in the whole of this chamber of horrors was the engine known as the Iron Virgin, which stood near the center of the room. It was a rudely shaped figure of a woman. One would hardly have recognized it as intended for a human figure at all, had not the founder shaped on the forehead a rude semblance of a woman's face. A section of the front was hinged like a door at one side. The door was of equal thickness and of great weight, for it took the custodian all his strength, aided though he was by the contrivance of the pulley, to open it. The weight was partly due to the fact that the door was of manifest purpose, hung so as to throw its weight downwards, so that it might shut of its own accord when the strain was released. The inside was honeycombed with rust, nay more, the rust alone that comes through time would hardly have eaten so deep into the iron walls. The rust of the cruel stains were deep indeed. It was only, however, when we came to look at the inside of the door that the diabolical intention was manifest to the full. Here were several long spikes, square and massive, broad at the base and sharp at the points, placed in such a position that when the door should close, the upper ones would pierce the eyes of the victim, and the lower ones his heart and vitals." End quote. The image Stoker paints here basically resembles what I think all of us are mostly familiar with. That specific image, though. How long before him does it date back to? If a lot of popular torture museums were to be believed, isn't it weird how that's actually a thing, by the way? Then perhaps over 1,000 years. After everything I've said, though, I imagine a lot of you are expecting a more modest date. Maybe it's more like half a millennia, 300 years, 200 years. Well, if you ask a lot of historians that are in some way familiar with Iron Maidens, many of them would say that it's just a century. 101 years to be exact. Let's meet Johann Philipp Siebenkees, a German philologist that lived during the mid to late 1700s, who is often pointed to as having the first documentation of the Iron Maiden in this 1792 source, which was the second volume in a series of his that tells of and gives details about the city he was most familiar with, Nuremberg, a popular 1838 English translation of the relevant excerpt, which Siebenkees reports as coming from a contemporary chronicle, one that he would fail to mention, reads as follows, quote, "In the year of our Lord 1533, the Iron Virgin was constructed, for the punishment of evildoers within the wall of the Frog's Tower, opposite the place called the Seven Ropes. So, at least, it was publicly given out to justify the thing. Therein was an iron statue, 7 feet high, which stretched abroad both its arms in the face of the criminal, and death by this machine was said to send the poor sinner to the fishes, for so soon as the executioner moved the step on which it stood. It hewed, with broad hand swords, the criminal into little pieces, which were swallowed by the fishes in the hidden waters. Such secret tribunals existed formerly in many countries. I do not, however, know whether any traces yet remain of the one here described, and I have never read that any use was ever made of it. Perhaps the whole affair may be nothing more than a legend. End quote. Looking at the description itself, however, already things seem to be a little weird, as this doesn't sound exactly like our Iron Maiden. In some way, it seems to be connected to some sort of trapdoor, and although that is not necessarily contradictory to our popular image, this definitely struck me as a little bit novel. Beyond that, things get weirder. The language around it is much more mechanical, and less of the very rude yet still frightening metalwork that is typical of our common conception. The method of execution sounds different too. One is not entombed and pierced from all sides, but instead sliced into fish bite-sized pieces. We'll come back to this later, but the key thing I want you to hold on to for now is the air of mystery attributed to it, the secrecy, the untraceability, and the lack of documented use, which ultimately leads to the expression of Sibenki's own doubt. Alongside that, however, is something that's become a bit of a stumbling block to me, which is that there is another account attributed to Sibenki's. Before I bias you towards or against it, I'll let you hear it with your own fresh ears. The passage is usually summarized as this. In 1515, somewhere in Germany, a coin forger was executed by being placed into some sort of coffin device that was lined with spikes on the inside. By some means, the man was executed slowly, the spikes ordered in such a way as to cause him immense pain, but not so far as to be immediately lethal. He remained in this device for some amount of days, lamenting and crying over his circumstances before ultimately perishing. The reason I'm telling you this in my own words rather than his is because those very words have remained to this point entirely elusive. I went through his relevant works pretty thoroughly and I found nothing, and even in the literature talking about Iron Maidens that would be published, especially the most important ones that would come in the decades following his account, I haven't found it referred to even once. So while this 1515 report does line up with our conception of an Iron Maiden more than his other documented passage, I'm highly suspicious of its origin. I'm not going to factor it into my later calculations in the grand scheme of what I'll reveal to you. Sibenki's himself could have very well just been a footnote in that, but since this is near universally brought up, I felt the need to inform you of this. A common accusation I've heard levied against Sibenki's is that he was very likely just making this up, and frankly, I don't understand that. This is usually portrayed as him perhaps getting caught up in the craze of what was basically the new genre of gothic horror, and wanting to contribute to it, made up this. The passage itself doesn't really read like that to me, and furthermore it's confined to just such a small passage in an already very niche book. There is much more that will further exonerate Sibenki's, but even just sticking to what can easily be found on the internet, this could be pretty immediately denied. I say that because it doesn't take one too long to come upon the details given by another man, Johann Georg Keisler, a German polymath who lived during the late 1600s to mid-1700s. Towards the end of his lifetime, he would publish a series of travelogues telling of his experiences and findings throughout Central Europe, with this small passage from his first volume in 1740 being of interest to us. The 1756 English translation of his work, coming this time in the second volume, reads as follows, quote, "In the above-mentioned hall of the old arsenal in another trabochetto, or trapdoor, through which malefactors were let fall into a machine, where by a kind of large razors they were at once cut into pieces. This instrument the French call oubliettes, but at present no more of it is to be seen in this castle than of the Iron Maidens, concerning which so many idle stories are told, at the castle of Plassenburg, the White Tower at Prague, and other places." End quote. Although we are not given a description by Keisler of what exactly the Iron Maiden he is referring to even is, given the context of what he is talking about, it appears to be some other form of execution, being present in at least modern-day Czechia or Germany. One could even assume that Iron Maidens are popularly known of enough to the point where he just expects his audience to know what he's talking about, and by his wording, it seems to really be a thing of legend or hearsay. Regarding his account, I don't really know how one could venture to malign him as just making stuff up. He doesn't even describe it, he just tells us there's something called an Iron Maiden. If he was making it up, he would have described it. The most important thing, though, is that even with everything I found that I'll show you later in this video, this is actually one of the earlier dates, putting this now many decades before the Victorian era. To give some transitional thoughts before we get into the meaty part of this video, already, going off this, stuff that is pretty reasonably accessible with some light internet browsing, I think we can say the revisionist view that Iron Maidens were just something that the Victorians made up isn't accurate, and whatever the Iron Maiden was, regardless of if it actually existed in reality or not, we can assume that discourse on it was present in at least the High Enlightenment period, and that maybe the Victorians were popularizers or something. As much as that is in vogue these days, this doesn't actually seem like something you can just blame on the Victorians. If you go online and view some front page articles or videos on this subject, a lot of the time the evidence actually just stops right there. See Benke's and maybe Keisler, and that's about it. Some of them do go a bit deeper than that, though, and pursue this investigation from an interesting angle, and I want to entreat it to, which are the possible inspirations for the Iron Maiden prior to the writings of these two men. There have been a lot of experimental punishments throughout history that people more intelligent and well-read than I am have pointed to as having been a potential prototype for the Iron Maiden, which again, regardless of if it was just within the machinations of someone's imagination, or if the device was actually manifested into our reality. And I want to take those theories seriously. There could be actually a lot of devices or stories depending on how you want to choose to break things up, but there are just 3 for this video that I'll be giving any substantial focus to, as only those ones will be crucial to understanding our conversations later in this video. Oh, and consider subscribing too, by the way. I feel like I should say that at least somewhere, like early on in the video. I hope you keep watching. It'll only get more and more interesting after this. Prototype 1. Pillories. Easily, the most common theory I have found proposed by people that are much more educated than me is that our image of an Iron Maiden comes from an alteration of some form of medieval or early modern pillory. For those like myself who, before this video, weren't involved in the subculture of people interested in the older forms of punishment, a pillory is essentially just a wooden or metallic device designed to, in some way, restrict the use of an individual's head, hands, or arms, and in a way that presents them to the public in a humiliating fashion. The most famous one that I'd expect most people to recognize is this one. It's a block of wood often connected to the ground like a sign, which one would be forced to awkwardly put their arms and heads into, usually as a penalty for drunkenness or some other form of delinquency. You would, for some duration of time, be subjected to people walking past you with either disappointment, jest, and in the worst cases you might have varyingly dangerous objects thrown at you. This specific device probably comes about in the High Middle Ages and seems to largely disappear over the course of the 1800s. Attentive audience members may be thinking that this sounds literally nothing like an Iron Maiden, and you'd be right. Nobody, as far as I'm aware, is trying to say that. What is often said, however, is that there are some similar devices, still close enough to be classified as pillories, that do show some resemblance to our Iron Maiden. The one most often pointed to is this thing, which has gone by a variety of names: shandmantle, shanatone, shamecoat, barrel of shame, the drunkard's cloak, and a lot of other regional variants. Essentially, it's some big, impractical barrel, bucket, or other roughly cylindrical object that an offending person is put into. Their head comes out the top end, their legs or feet come out the bottom end, maybe their hands are poking out the sides like a little T-Rex, and upon adorning this piece of fashion, they are made to waddle out in front of everybody to look really clumsy and stupid, for the purposes of bringing an appropriately dissuading humiliation upon that individual. This theory that I'll try my best to describe in Steelman is most often associated with Professor Wolfgang Schild of the University of Belfield in Germany, who overall seems to be a pretty trustworthy and reliable source on legal and criminal history in medieval and early modern Central Europe. The publication where he proposes this theory is sadly unavailable to me, so I've had to try and reconstruct his hypothesis from institutions linked to him as well as statements from individuals that I presume have read his work. So I apologize if I get anything wrong. The best understanding I've gathered from reading everything is this. At some point in pre-Victorian Europe, some sort of proto-Iron Maiden was developed, as in a kind of sarcophagus or coffin-like object, one that is given the shape of a woman, but importantly it is absent of its spikes and instead serves the same function as the shamecoat, or whatever you prefer to call it, from earlier. It is a container, one that a person could be forced to stand in and just kind of feel stupid that they're even there, whether he or other proponents of this theory believe that this hypothetical device comes out of the traditional practice of shamecoats, or if it is more so a case of simultaneous invention. I've heard no word on that. Around the turn of the 19th century, though, in stride with the Gothic horror genre's genesis and boom, spikes were fixed to these devices as a way to capitalize off of them. The Victorians were captivated by that idea and popularized that mutated image over the 1800s. This theory, one that Professor Schild seems to have first published in the late 1990s, if true, is something that I actually hope to kind of incorporate into my hypothesis, although it is by no means a make or break issue for me. Here, what appears to be the basis for his conceptualization. First is his expertise in German legal codes. If anyone on the planet should know about any attestation to these as an officially prescribed punishment anywhere in Central Europe, he should probably be one of those people. And according to him and basically everyone else, there is no mention of anything like them anywhere. And I'm just going to trust that. Like, straight up, I haven't even looked in those places in my search. Thus, the only way a device like that could have existed is if they weren't even relevant to that context. Or maybe even weren't important enough to be mentioned in any context. Which, if he is right that these originally lacked their spikes, that is well within reason for what is basically just a glorified timeout corner at that point. One could object that at that point it could just be an entire fabrication then, which is where his second area of focus comes in, his examination of individual specimens. I don't know how many Iron Maidens he looked at. So many of them have been made at this point that you could probably spend a whole lifetime doing it. But apparently at some point he looked at some of them and found an interesting pattern. The shell of the Iron Maiden often in some way dated back to the centuries before the Victorian surge in interest, meanwhile the spikes dated to around that time. I don't know what method or how he even goes about determining that, but I trust him. Thus, we get the theory that these weird woman-shaped containers may have just been ambulating around Central Europe for some centuries prior, and that they had to have been used for some purpose, and a probable one could be that they filled a similar role to other objects meant to enclose people, like the shamecoat. Eventually, though, some opportunist would see one of these devices rotting away in some medieval castle, filled it with spikes as a bit of a tourist attraction, and it caught on to the point that I'm here talking about it over 200 years later. Neat thing is, there actually is a bit of a regional precedent for this line of thought. As far as I've heard, this wasn't actually a practice that existed, but there appears to have been a more mythical punishment in some of the contemporary Germanic folklore of a barrel, what is normally a pretty mundane device, but one that could hypothetically be used in punishments, being lined with spikes on the interior, from which an offender would be rolled around in to the point of their death. All of that being said, I will pretty bluntly disagree with this formulation, but on a lot of weird premises. I think Professor Schild's research and methodology is valid, and actually I wouldn't even really consider myself to be in a position to challenge that, but I am reluctantly willing to be so presumptuous as to say that I think he may have erred in adopting one big presupposition, one that he, writing basically 3 decades ago, wasn't even in a position to try and question, and it is that the object that he spent so much time poring over very likely isn't the Iron Maiden that Siebenkees, to give an example we're all familiar with, thought of in his head when he wrote. To be even more provocative, I'd even be skeptical if the thing that Siebenkees imagined is at all close to what Keisler even imagined. I say that while very much respecting Professor Schild's contributions to this piece of folklore, and I will bring him up again later in the video. Only somebody actively researching this in maybe the last decade could have the free wealth of internet knowledge to start questioning this standard image that we're all familiar with. I'm in the very privileged position to be able to take a search term, its grammatical and historical variants, plug that into various old document archives, and get at least a glimpse into what people in history were actually saying about this device. And he, unfortunately, wasn't. That being said, he could probably do an infinitely better job at processing the data that I've collected. I basically know nothing about German history, which would probably help in making sense of a lot of the stuff here. Prototype 2. The Chest of Regulus. In my original script for this supposed device, I talked a good bit more about the scholarship of what exactly may have happened, but I'm going to lay off of that in favor of just giving you the popular narrative. 1, just the reality of time and attention constraints, but 2, the more practical truth that if this were to have inspired Iron Maidens, only the popular rendition would have had the capacity to do so. With that said, here we are interested in the death of Marcus Atilius Regulus, the famed Roman consul from the First Punic War against the Carthaginian Empire. If you are a Roman history fanboy, or have at least watched that one oversimplified video, you should know where this is going. His death would take place in approximately 256 BC, and in the centuries following that, a lot would be said about his death by many writers. St. Augustine, often considered a top 3 theologian ever by basically most Christians, and furthermore just a decently important historical figure in general, communicates what is probably the most remembered rendition of this story all the way later in the early 400s AD. Quote, Marcus Atilius Regulus, a Roman general, was a prisoner in the hands of the Carthaginians, but they, being more anxious to exchange their prisoners with the Romans than to keep them, sent Regulus as a special envoy with their ambassadors to negotiate this exchange, but bound him first with an oath that if he failed to accomplish their wish, he would return to Carthage. He went and persuaded the Senate to the opposite course, because he believed it was not for the advantage of the Roman Republic to make an exchange of prisoners. After he had thus exerted his influence, the Romans did not compel him to return to the enemy, but what he had sworn he voluntarily performed. But the Carthaginians put him to death with refined, elaborate, and horrible tortures. They shut him up in a narrow box, in which he was compelled to stand, and in which finely sharpened nails were fixed all round about him, so that he could not lean upon any of it without intense pain, and so they killed him by depriving him of sleep. End quote. Again, regardless of whether or not this actually happened, it is not at all a crazy opinion to state that this sorta really does sound like our Iron Maiden. The only really big difference here is that the torture doesn't come from the spikes themselves, but the necessity of avoiding those spikes. Crucially, though, because this passage was embedded in one of the more influential pieces of Western literature, Augustine's City of God, it not only had the privilege of being a more remembered story, to the point that it could have inspired other instruments, but furthermore, there are a plentitude of artistic depictions that have accompanied this passage. Some of them look much more like an ice cream sandwich than an Iron Maiden. Some of them really seem to resemble that spiky barrel I mentioned earlier, but others, and especially some of the later ones, really do look like the modern conception of an Iron Maiden, although there is a considerable lack of any statements or writings linking the two ideas. There is also a similar device reported of in 9th century Mesopotamia that has in recent decades occasionally been compared to an Iron Maiden. It's referred to as a tanur, or oven, and may itself have been potentially inspired by the stories around Regulus, but I don't really think there's much in the way of actually linking those two objects. It's even more divergent from any conception of an Iron Maiden, but furthermore, it's still a pretty obscure story, even to this day in its native Islamic background, so even the chance for inspiration doesn't seem to be there. Overall, though, while I do think the device connected with Regulus does appear to be close to what we're looking for, I don't think there's actually much of a chance for this to actually lead anywhere, especially in comparison to our next object of interest. Prototype 3, the Iron Apega. Moving just a bit forward in history from the First Punic War, and now towards the eastern Mediterranean, we can now take a look at the supposed fundraising tactics of King Nabis, the tyrant of Sparta from 207 BC to 192 BC. In this case, we are drawing from just a single source, the histories of Polybius. He actually is a source for Regulus too, but his specific data there is beyond the scope of this video. Besides that, writing in the early mid-2nd century BC, and after describing the methods for how Nabis consolidated his power over Sparta, Polybius then tells of him doing this. Quote, he next had constructed a kind of machine, if machine it may be called, which was the figure of a woman, clothed in costly garments, and made to resemble with extraordinary fidelity the wife of Nabis. Whenever then he summoned one of the citizens with a view of getting some money from him, he used first to employ a number of arguments politely expressed, pointing out the danger in which the city stood from the threatening attitude of the Achaeans, and explaining what a number of mercenaries he had to support for their security, and the expenses which fell upon him for the maintenance of the national religion and the needs of the state. If the listeners gave in, he was satisfied, but if they ever refused to comply with his demand, he would say, Perhaps I cannot persuade you, but I think this Lady Apega will succeed in doing so. Apega was the name of his wife. Immediately on his saying these words, the figure I have described was brought in. As soon as the man offered his hand to the supposed lady to raise her from her seat, the figure threw its arms round him and began drawing him by degrees towards its breasts. Now its arms, hands, and breasts were full of iron spikes under its clothes. When the tyrant pressed his hands on the back of the figure, and then by means of the works dragged the man by degrees closer and closer to its breasts, he forced him under this torture to say anything. A good number of men refused his demands. He destroyed in this way. End quote. Once again, ignoring any debate about how reliable the specific language presented in this passage even is, how trustworthy Polybius is, if this could even be done in 200-ish BC Sparta, all of which are sub-questions to if any of this actually happened. I suspect at this point many of you listeners are scratching your heads a little bit. This purported device of Sparta probably does not line up with what you're imagining as an Iron Maiden in your head. Like, yeah, I guess it uses feminine imagery and it kills you with spikes, but that's about it. And, well, I agree, fully, but not on the grounds that it doesn't really seem to be an Iron Maiden. Rather that your conception of what an Iron Maiden even is has an extremely complicated historical foundation. Now I can finally get to the part of the video that I am interested in, the question of what even is an Iron Maiden. Most of everything after this is, for better or for worse, pretty unique to my own research. Like, I really wish I could stress just how much the information easily findable on the internet just kinda halts right at there. The German Wikipedia page presents the normal coffin image, dates it to Siebenke's reference, along with mentions of the Apega, the tenor, and the promotion of the theory that it's just some form of exaggerated pillory. The English Wikipedia page also presents that same coffin view, dates it to Siebenke's as well, mentioning the tenor, pillories, the Apega, and the chest of Regulus alongside it. And a lot of important dictionaries just give the usual definition of a mythical torture device shaped like a coffin with spikes on the inside, and maybe also dated to Keisler. And that's kind of it. Most published articles or YouTube videos you'll find online are synthesizing information from those three sources, and probably drawing from Schild's work as well, directly or indirectly. Sometimes there's a little bit more talk about specific Iron Maiden specimens, most notably the destroyed Iron Maiden of Nuremberg and its copy, and another notable one called the Feistritz Maiden. I haven't heard word on that one since the 1970s, but it is of very high importance regarding this field of study. You'll see me cover it again just in a few moments. Originally, and aside from one thing which I'll mention briefly right at the end of the video, the material I wanted to cover for my original script also finished at that point, although many individual elements were expanded upon. But in big part due to this one single article, which briefly mentions this one source, one that would make me realize just how much deeper this went. I was then prompted to expand my research to the extent that I don't think anyone realized could have been possible. So if things feel a little all over the place or too condensed past this point in the video, then that's why. If you're curious about anything that you think I may be able to elaborate further on, feel free to ask in the comments or reach out in some other way. Back to that one source I mentioned, the one that is mostly responsible for me being sent down this rabbit hole, let us investigate the findings of another curious researcher, Robert Lucas Pearsall, an English composer who lived from 1795 to 1856, who, in an 1838 archaeology journal, 46 years after Siebenke's wrote, had a rather striking letter of his published. It documented the findings of an investigation of his in Germany from 1832 to 1834 into a supposedly ancient form of punishment, as he put it, one which even in his time was viewed with a great skepticism, called the Kiss of the Virgin, and says that there it was widely recognized and understood, in his words, that, quote, in certain towers and prisons there was a terrible engine which not only destroyed life, but also annihilated the body of the person sacrificed, and this, being constructed in the form of a young girl, was called the Virgin. End quote. Most of the report documents his travels across Europe seeking out this elusive device, a lot of which is ripe with information that was very, very valuable to me, but for the sake of just giving the basics, I'll skip to the climactic passage. After chasing leads all across Central Europe, he learned of one belonging to a Baron Diedrich of Vienna, held in a castle called Feistritz, and apparently having in some way come from the French Revolution. He obtained permission to visit this device, producing these images and its accompanying description, which gives what is largely the same understanding that you're familiar with through popular media. If there is one singular piece of literature that ought to be seen as a touchstone for any investigation into Iron Maidens, it is the understanding that Pearsall articulates about this specific instrument right here. Every treatment of the subject after him becomes increasingly conformed to that image, often flattening the idea of an Iron Maiden simply to just what he presented here. But crucially, there was something that was being flattened, as pretty much everything before this treatment of his was also fundamentally different. Pertaining to this object, there's before Pearsall's publication and after Pearsall's publication. Before he presented this image, which would quickly be taken as the primary and often only conceptualization, there was an incredible diversity in how the Iron Maiden was described. A lot of the video past this point is just going to be me reading and summarizing old passages I recovered until I can drill that point into your head. To preface things a little though, this is genuinely a subject that I think I could speak on for hours, but my ambitions for this video are merely introductory. That way the conversation can at least be started, because right now, this is pretty much an entirely unaddressed but incredibly complex branch of folklore that there isn't even anyone to talk about with it, other than myself, so once again I encourage anyone with clarifying questions to please go and ask them. I am sick of this being in my head alone. After I've gone through all of that though, I'm going to go ahead and try and give my estimate for what I anticipate to be common questions. Emphasis on the word estimate, because, spoiler, at this stage into my inquiry, I still don't really know too much for certain. Think stuff like whether this was strictly confined to folklore, or if any of the objects described actually existed, and if so, could they have even been used. Other stuff like if this may have been more of an execution device or more of a torture device, or maybe even something else. Where specifically was this device told of? When does this date back to? And more. Well, it actually just makes sense to go ahead and answer that last one, because I want to present my data to you before I start. For my analysis, I'm relying on nearly 40 unique documents, starting at Pearsall and going all the way back to my first, and maybe even favorite single mention so far, all the way back in 1686, so a period of around 150 years. However, I don't believe this at all dates it just back to the late 17th century, because even just by the material internally present in that singular mention, and many others, it really does seem to predate that. A modest estimate, I think, might put its genesis around the early mid-1600s, but I'd be willing to maybe go for a mid or early 1500s estimate, but at this stage, definitely not 1400s. This really does seem to be a thing confined to the early modern period, and not actually medieval, even if some of the data within our period of focus do suggest that. I did my best to collect everything I could before the year 1800, but there was such an influx around the year 1800 that past that point I will admit that I might have let quite a lot escape my attention. You may think this has to do something with Sibenkis, but not really, despite the weird focus on him in particular, which really just seems to come from the fact that he was referenced in Pearsall's work. His account, as interesting as it may be, is just one of the many alike accounts within the preceding and succeeding decades from him. Really, that influx seems to come from the fact that there was a weird amount of plays that began employing Iron Maidens as set pieces around the turn of that century, or at least that's my current hypothesis. Oh, and for anyone who becomes curious enough to look into this, be aware that giving forms of punishment, execution, or torture names that in some way reference themes of virginity, femininity, or romance, all of which are sometimes attributed to the Iron Maiden, were actually sort of common at the time. There's a sort of proto-guillotine in Scotland simply called the Maiden. There seems to have been a basic form of pillory in Germany during the 1700s called that too. There's something actually called an Iron Maiden in 1700s Germany that either seems to be some weird form of prison cell or some type of pole pillory that I'm showing on screen. And beyond those three, there's even more examples I could point to. Pearsall references a lot of these in his work. And beyond even that, the words iron and maiden and their equivalents in other languages have just been used before in ways that contextually and grammatically make sense without actually referencing the device that we are interested in. So you're just going to have to sift through all of that. I believe the most appropriate place to begin our discussion is with two elements that are near universally present in accounts or mentions of the Iron Maiden. The first is that in some way it kisses you, and second is that in some way it hugs you. First, the kiss. You heard Pearsall reference this earlier. I recognize this one way more often. In fact, it was so prevalent that I'd be willing to say that it was similarly, if not more accurate, to say that there was a form of execution called kissing the maiden, rather than that there was an execution device called the Iron Maiden. If you read the data, I think it really is just that in your face. This, in my opinion, is largely euphemistic. The reading I've gathered is that kissing this mysterious maiden is synonymous with being executed by it. Second is the hug. This one is also very, but still less common, I think. And you might expect this to also be somewhat of a euphemism. That classic image you're thinking of doesn't really have arms, so it can't technically perform a hug, but having its doors close around you may give one the impression of some sort of embrace. I, however, would disagree with that sentiment. I think this highly present language of an embrace is instead just quite plain. I think that the Iron Maiden could, and in fact was just designed to, whether in reality or just hypothetically, simply to just give you a hug. A rather discomforting hug, but still a hug. Recall Nabis's device from earlier, what has been popularly or nichely dubbed as the Iron Pega. I am still undecided as to how likely it is that this supposed invention inspired the tales of the Iron Maidens, but the most common image that I found described across my dataset resembles that more than just about anything else. I think a lot of people repeat this link without knowing why it was used so much. As I said, on the surface the two don't really seem to share that much, but there is a reason that authors both before and after Pearsall used this device as a comparison. In the 1700s, a century in which one must be grateful to find any small reference, there are actually two mentions of the comparison, albeit they are later in the century and don't tell of anything beyond that. As a demonstration of what I mean, I'll present to you this image, an 1868 illustration of what the author perceived an Iron Maiden to have possibly looked like. Furthermore, he gives the classic Pearsall image, but on top of that adds this, a much more mechanical looking variety. I've actually found posts online where people use these older images that in reality were originally telling of the Iron Maiden to instead try and show what the Iron Pega may have looked like, perhaps not even aware of the original context. To give you a more text-based description, I'll give you this passage from 1825. It's a bit late, but this seems to have been one of the more circulated passages in the Victorian era. And this is actually one of the few more lengthy descriptions that you get, since most were pretty short or scattered over longer texts. It purports the findings in Toledo, Spain, around 1808 to 1809, of devices supposedly once used by the Inquisition there. Quote, only one of these implements, unique in its kind for refined cruelty, and disgraceful to reason and religion for the choice of its object, seems deserving of more particular notice. In a recess in a subterraneous vault, contiguous to the private hall for examinations, stood a wooden figure, made by the hands of monks, and representing the Blessed Virgin. A gilded glory encompassed her head, and in her right hand she held a banner. It struck us all at the first sight that, notwithstanding the silken robe descending on each side in the copious folds from her shoulders, she should wear a sort of cuirass. On closer investigation, it appeared that the forepart of the body was stuck full of extremely sharp nails and small narrow knife blades, with the points of both turned towards the spectator. The arms and hands were jointed, and machinery behind the partition set the figure in motion. One of the servants of the Inquisition was compelled, by command of the general, to work the machine, as he termed it, when the figure extended her arms, as though to press someone most lovingly to her heart. The well-filled knapsack of the Polish grenadier was made to supply the place of a living victim. The statue hugged it closer and closer, and when the attendant, agreeably to orders, made the figure unclasp her arms and return to her former position, the knapsack was perforated to the depth of 2 or 3 inches, and remained hanging on the points of the nails and knife blades.
End quote. To give an earlier example, this passage from 1741 reports the conflicting thoughts of a Zurich resident and his internal struggles in having to discern between Catholicism or Protestantism. Quote, "You are walking straight towards eternal damnation if you do not return to the true church, in which alone eternal salvation is to be found. Ah, why do you so hate your immortal soul? You are indeed a lost son, but the merciful God is still that profoundly good and loving Father who will receive his returning Son in a fatherly embrace, without a deadly maiden's kiss, and look upon him with grace. For he does not desire the death of the sinner, but that he turns back and lives eternally." End quote. So much of what I'm dealing with is stuff like that second example. A single sentence or footnote, which I can maybe try to extrapolate a few things from, but that's really it. But in both of these cases, the idea that it is some sort of female figure that gives you some sort of deadly hug can be inferred or read. To show you what I think is maybe one of my favorite individual things that I found throughout my search, I'll present to you this image. It comes from an 1843 edition of a play originally published in 1806, in which an Iron Maiden is used as a narrative set piece. This is really what I've began to gravitate towards imagining as the classic image, in which the Iron Maiden turns out to actually have just been a maiden, with some unfortunate bits of iron here and there. I don't want you to get too bought into that image, though, as there seems to have been a lot of variation, specifically that in some cases it was said to have been wielding swords. To quote a 1764 passage, quote, "In ancient times, as it is said, there was a punishment for traitors to the state which was called the Virgin's Kiss. The delinquent was led into a dark place. To make matters worse, his eyes were also bound. He had to advance toward a wooden statue which looked like a woman and which held a sword in each hand. When he then stepped up and wished to give the maiden the kiss, she embraced him in a cruel manner and cut him apart through the middle. We have not seen such a machine, and we can also say that we doubt whether it ever existed. Nevertheless, since there is something true in most stories, we are very much tempted to believe that the entire punishment consisted of such kisses and such embraces as those of which you speak." End quote. To show an example of this image can be found accompanying an 1840 description of Iron Maidens. If you were to reread the famed 1792 passage from Siebenke's, it really becomes impossible to see it as anything but that. This is all really cool, and I wish I had more antique images to show you, but visually things kinda stop at that for now. However, what an Iron Maiden could be seen as, in my opinion, varies even more than that. As I said earlier, there were a lot of plays around the turn of the 19th century that featured them as set pieces, and a lot of them went in really weird directions. This ranges from ghosts, what are basically crazy battle robots, all the way to becoming a sacrificial method dedicated to the Norse pantheon. I'm serious, and if you've played Elden Ring before, at a certain point it feels like they got turned into that one enemy that everybody hated. I just want to stress that for everything I said there, I wish I could show you like 10 other pieces of contextual or corroborating information, and give my thoughts on it at that length. Even for something relatively minor like the inclusion of the Virgin Mary in a lot of imagery, I could talk on that for like an hour maybe, especially so as a Catholic, but I want to keep things relatively short. Because of that, there's one other issue, or cluster of issues, that I want to devote a significant amount of time to, which is that although this image of an actual woman might at this point seem like it should supersede all other images at the expense of even discarding them, I personally am not really a fan of that decision. The most pressing example of what I mean here has to do with the classic coffin image that I think we are all familiar with by this point. At this stage in the video, you might think that the image Pearsall depicted is just some late, arbitrary invention of his, and that maybe we should all just forget about it. But I really do think he was being authentic. Not only from the fact that he seems sincere and that he put so much effort into his research, but also that it doesn't exactly come out of nowhere. Consider this passage from Joseph Schiffner in 1803. Quote, "If the prisoner would not confess the crime and reveal his accomplices, he was subjected to torture. Among the various kinds of torment, the so-called Iron Maiden was the most remarkable. It consisted of a machine assembled from iron plates in the form of an adult human being, into whose hollow interior the person to be tortured was placed. When the torture was applied, the two outer sides had to be screwed toward one another. The more these closed together and pressed upon the enclosed person, the more violently he was tormented. He suffered especially intense anxiety and had to possess exceptional bodily endurance if he was to withstand the required degree of pain. The machine was called the Iron Maiden because, in female form, it spread out its hands towards the criminal and, as it were, appeared to embrace him. End quote. Aside from the mention of the arms there at the end, in which, in my opinion, it sounds like the author had some conflicting information that he wasn't sure what to do with, this really does sound so much like our classic coffin image. And even more interestingly, it seems to vindicate people's confusion on how exactly this coffin image was supposed to be a torture device. It's funny, there has been for a long time a debate on how exactly the Iron Maiden, in the context of the classic image we are all familiar with, was supposed to not kill its victim immediately. And in this case, it seems that the answer just appears to be that originally it didn't have spikes. It just compressed you to a torturous degree. This seems to vindicate the hypothesis of individuals like Professor Schild, that the spikes are in fact not original to the device, but it provides an alternative explanation that instead of being a pillory, it actually could be a torture device by means of some form of crushing. Unfortunately, and aside from one passage from 1776 that compares the Iron Maidens to the tortures of Regulus, the trail for the coffin image sadly stops there as of right now. Although I think I could do much more work in that corner. I think developments will be made in this area, and I have a few hunches about some stuff that I can't fully go into, but whatever is hopefully found, I think it'll be pretty interesting. Really though, I believe that this coffin image is very likely the best example for what I am calling the graft hypothesis. To start, let's look at this passage from Pearsall, which documents his thoughts before he found the device that we are now all familiar with. Quote, "The account which I received both of its form and movements were often inconsistent. Some represented it to be an image of the Virgin Mary, which the culprit was told to kiss, and which, on being touched by him, was set in motion by inward machinery, which caused the figure to fall down and crush him. Others said its arms expanded and clasped him to a breast out of which poniards protruded. Others again represented it merely as an emblem of justice, placed above a trapdoor on which the culprit trod as he advanced to pay her his homage, and which, being left unbolted, sank underneath his weight, and precipitated him into an abyss. The tradition relative to the machine contained in the Tower of Mainz represented it to be a sort of hollow wheel, furnished in the inside with knives, which, on being made to turn around rapidly, cut to pieces everything that might be in the inside." End quote. Now, take a look at this passage from 1686, our earliest reference point at this moment. Quote, "Ministers of this formidable kind, under the pretext of honor, must either be removed and sent elsewhere, as was practiced with the Duke of Alba in the Netherlands, or, if it is established that they are plotting the invasion of the state, they must be put to death, which nowadays is often done secretly in courts. Let there be noted here the Maiden at Dresden, as also those at Stockholm and Vienna, and the Heidelberg Tower, in which there is a clock of very sharp swords, and the fishes at Nuremberg, etc., punishments whose cruelty can scarcely be excused except by reason of state." End quote. Although the specific forms of punishment described by each author don't overlap perfectly, we can clearly see that in the late 1600s there was a form of execution called the Maiden, with a few other forms of punishment in some way associated with it, but by the time of Pearsall, and probably well before that, they had become one with the Maiden. I don't know how clearly I've been able to make this point, but the variability with how the Iron Maiden is described, and the various motifs in some way associated with it, are truly vast. A trapdoor, a river, and sometimes fishes are all relatively common inclusions, and often accompanying this is this very ambiguous imagery of justice. An older theory I saw regarding that is that it has its origin in the Lady Justice statue that you find in a lot of places. There is the inclusion of a wheel or whirling engine of blades, which I think may have some relation to the French oubliettes, as Keisler was just one of the many people to mention that and the Iron Maiden together. I wouldn't be surprised if all of these aforementioned pieces work together in some way, even within these categories, if categories should even be made. There is an incredible variation. And then there's still the classic coffin image, which is still a bit of a mystery, and then of course the actual woman that is either covered in spikes and or wielding swords, all of which also seems to have its own internal variability. Really, for something that is so often spoke of with secrecy and mystery over what I estimate to be a pretty large area of Europe, one should expect nothing less considering how long ago this dates to. I've debated as whether I think there even is one original image for the Iron Maiden, or if it was some sort of class of execution device given the figure of a woman. To harp on this point again, I'm still a little worried that if this spread around enough, people might come to resent that coffin image a little, seeing it as having paved over what is probably the original folklore, and I really hope that doesn't happen. I'm calling my theory the graft hypothesis for a reason, because while yes, whatever the coffin motif prototype probably was not originally called an Iron Maiden, I do at least expect that there was an association there. I think that this mysterious trapdoor, this ever ambiguous wheel, the whirling engine of blades, which just might be the same thing as that prior one, our Maiden, and that coffin image which we've all become familiar with, may all belong to a sort of larger pantheon of mytho-historical Germanic forms of punishment that sadly just got lost. Like it or not, that is the way the folklore changed and became preserved. I think the name of the maiden got remembered, and the image of perhaps its sister got remembered instead. While I'd like to have the best understanding possible, this is an area where I'm happy to be content with there being no straightforward answer yet, or even always. There can be what it originally was, what it evolved into, what got grafted into it, and what it got remembered as, and there can be a range within each of those things, and in each case we can joyfully pronounce that it truly was an Iron Maiden, and be glad that we can even try to come and know this lost and striking bit of folklore. And as one last thing before my little Q&A section, please, please, free my Boise Benkies. Although his personal Wikipedia page now does at least mention Keisler's account, which does exonerate him a little bit. Basically, the only thing he is historically remembered for is his involvement with the Iron Maiden, and most sources still report him as something like its inventor. There is a plentitude of sources prior to him giving so many of the same details, and considering the 1686 mention of the fishes of Nuremberg, it seems clear that he is at least attempting to draw from something that predates his time by over a century. For the Q&A, I am just aiming to give short responses to questions that I anticipate to be really common. Question: do you think this actually existed, or do you think it was just confined to folklore? Answer: I think it's largely folkloric, and more precisely, I believe that this was just a piece of a larger set of folklore. But at the same time, I both expect that any given piece of folklore could definitely have its origin in some real object, but furthermore that people may endeavor to create objects inspired by their ambient folklore, similar to what happened with the sudden discovery of so many coffin-type maidens after Pearsall's images were published. Question: if these objects were real, do you think they may have even been used? Answer: the first thing I should say is that I hope not. In spite of the deep well of folklore here, it shouldn't be forgotten that we are swimming through something inherently dark and potentially tragic. At this stage, though, if they existed, I think it would have been an object used more so by individual and uniquely sadistic local rulers, rather than on any institutional level. I guess my answer would also vary there depending on which specific image you're talking about. Question: is this more of an execution device or a torture device? Answer: seems to be pretty plainly an execution device, although it appears that some forms of torture were grafted into it. Question: where did this exist as folklore, or maybe even as a used object? Answer: right now I'd put its cultural cradle in a pretty broad but definite region of Central Europe, places like modern-day East Germany, West Poland, Czechia, North Austria, Western Slovakia, and maybe some of Hungary, and that it also may have not been completely unknown in the Franco-Germanic regions, some of the Norse world, and perhaps further into Eastern Europe. Question: what are some good resources for this? Answer: I'm going to link some companion documents in the description, One should just be my sources for everything in the video, as well as some basic thoughts and context on them, and a second one that gives each of them an English translation if needed, which will be done by ChatGPT. Most of these are in German, and I've never even met a person who speaks German. I think they are mostly accurate. It seemed to most of the time pass the test of having it done over multiple times and by multiple engines, but still, try to take it with a grain of salt. Overall, though, this is a new area of study as far as I'm aware. I am the only one occupying it, and I really want other people here, so please read further if you want to. Question. Advice for looking into this myself. Answer. If it wasn't clear from my last statement, I recommend getting proficient at navigating the internet in multiple languages. Google has a lot of okay instant translation navigation features for text that you really want to get the precise meaning of, though I just use ChatGPT. I don't like AI, but they're good enough at it. Most of this will just come down to your endurance and being willing to scavenge through hundreds of random old documents and knowing how to get every possible variant of your relevant keywords. Once you learn it, and to be upfront, this is still something that I am very much learning, then it becomes a matter of patience and access to relevant websites and databases. Hope you enjoy. Question. Were there any places where the original understanding was preserved over the Coffin image? Answer. This is actually a pretty loaded question because what I estimate to be the more original understanding was preserved in more places than you'd think. The Coffin image dominated the German and English-speaking worlds especially, but in other places like the Dutch, Eastern European, and maybe French parts of Europe, some of the more original understanding seems to have maybe remained well up until basically the rise of the internet, still though rather nichely, on maybe more of an oral level. You'll find allusions to this in my notes, and it's actually kind of sad when you think about it. What I think is a more historic understanding seems to have survived longer by way of tradition, but once the internet allowed the more popular Western image to become the most authoritative and accessible one, it began outcompeting the native one. Question. Anything else? Answer. If you're a professor or a student involved in medieval or early modern European folklore or archaeology, if you think there is something here to be discovered, please look into it. If you make any progress, you'll probably be better funded in your studies for the rest of your life after that. And outside of this specific thing, I, compared to you, just don't have as high of an interest in that field. So feel free to try and reach out to me if you want to discuss anything. As I said, there are things here I wish I could talk on for much longer, and having someone who's just more familiar with European history and culture that may pick up on nuances that I couldn't probably would be interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if there was something that I mentioned in this very video that seemed like such an obvious connection to more educated people, which I was just doomed to miss. Question. What was that thing you said you were going to talk about a while ago that you never did? Answer. There are probably multiple cases of that, to be honest, but the main one I am thinking of is that originally, my pitch for this video is going to be more on the question of if anyone ever died from an Iron Maiden. I was going to go through the history of how it was probably a hoax, that there may have been some devices that inspired it, but those don't even count since those aren't technically Iron Maidens, and then ended off by talking about modern reported uses of Iron Maidens, because there actually is a very tragic case of somebody using that in pretty recent history to satisfy their individual sadism. The specific instance here is of Uday Hussein, Saddam Hussein's son, who supposedly used the device. And I just don't really want to talk about that anymore. It's sad. It puts a bit of a blemish on what I hope to be an interesting and ideally entirely mythical bit of lost folklore that I found. And I would hope that it can just remain as that. Okay, outro time, and I gotta record this quick since I am on 1%. Thank you for watching, especially this far for those still listening. I hope that I was able to make this somewhat worth your time and attention. God bless, and goodbye. I usually ramble a lot at the end, but I'm not really sure what else to really say here, other than just to try and show my gratitude to both you, the viewer, and just for the fact that I was graciously given the opportunity to discover this, or recover maybe, I'm not really sure what the right wording is there. So thanks be to God, you, and whoever in my life has got me to this point. Regarding other matters and to show my biases, I really do hope that this is mythical, both for the sake of nobody dying from what is actually a pretty cruel punishment, one that takes the image of what many men long for more than just about anything else in this life, the hug of some special woman, and distorting it into probably some of the worst final moments imaginable. But also, as I said earlier, I am Catholic and the church is very dear to me, and I hope this punishment is not a part of our history. Okay, well, I'm recording this section now like 15-20 minutes later because I had to let my device recharge. I was hoping to do that quickly, but it turns out that my recording room flow state is no match for my lack of planning. As I was saying, I didn't actually get much into this in the video, but one of the reasons this got seized on so hard by the Victorians was for Protestant versus Catholic polemics. So I really do hope that this mythos just kind of comes out of an earlier form of that or something. Maybe either us Catholics or some German Lutherans kept attributing something like this to each other during the 1600s, and that's how it caught on. I don't know. Worst case scenario, brutal violence and a kind not completely uncharacteristic for the place and time. Best case scenario is that it was still unchristlike slander, I guess, which is still bad. Either way, something dumb and bad probably happened a long time ago, and I guess I hope that in some weird way, me, some random guy, hundreds of years later, trying to figure out what actually happened and genuinely being fascinated by it, is in some way bringing a good out of that. I don't know. I hope so. But I think I'll stop rambling about here. I hope you subscribe, especially if you stayed this long, and leave a like or a comment too, maybe. To repeat myself again, thank you for watching, especially this far for those still listening. I hope that I was able to make this somewhat worth your time and attention. God bless, and goodbye.